can open, you can just pick up a tin.
Okay.
And we're rolling.
These books here are old books. They're real old, and a friend of mine gave them to me, an old gentleman, and he said, when he gave them to me, he says, I know that things have changed now from what they was when I had these books. But he says they got the fundamentals are still about the same in these. And he said, I want you to have them. And he was a big man, bushy-haired fella, had a booming voice. You could hear him. You could hear him a long ways off when he spoke. And he was a good fella. I liked him. A lot of people didn't, but he was a good man. And he was superintendent of a plant. And he come up this way. That's the way he got his education as a young man himself. And I appreciated him even thinking about me and offering me these books. And I'm glad that he gave them to me, because they've helped me in my lifetime, because I'd studied these books to try to get a little knowledge about the kind of work that I was doing and how to figure the things that what's supposed to be. And if they give you more details in these books, I don't know. I know most people that's got books, it'll tell you about how, like a manual, it'll tell you what to do and what not to do and how to do it. And that's good. It's fine. But there are things that happens that's not in this book, but it's a good starting point where you can come.
Talk about night school and then the unemployment.
Well, now, back in those days, they had night school. If you wanted to go to night school, you could. But you'd be surprised at the people that didn't want to go. And there'd be some of them, I think, would be more or less be ashamed to go because they couldn't read and they couldn't write. And that's sad to me, is when people can't even read a book or read a newspaper. But anyway, that you had an opportunity. If you wanted to go, you could. And so it was good that we took up these opportunities that the people give us, the officials of the state and the different ones, and to give you this opportunity to study and to learn more. And I appreciated that in my lifetime, about having the schools that we could go to if you wanted to go. And all these different things that they had for us back in those days in schools, but they didn't have things like we got it today now. It was a whole lot different.
Talk about your studying at night.
Well, when you'd go to whatever, I like textiles, and so I studied textiles at night. In fact, these books right here, they helped me even in that. I'd read these books if I run into a problem, even after I got to be overseer and supervisors in the mill, especially when I got to figuring out the dents in a reed, because as I said in the beginning of this, I didn't have but a 7th grade education. And when you begin to try to figure out 2 threads to a dent, 3 threads to a dent, I don't know where you fellas know what I'm talking about, but that's the reed that goes back and forth. It makes the cloth back in those days. And you'd have to figure out how long to make that reed and how many dents each one of those spaces, and there was a dent, that how many it would take to go in it. Well, sometime I couldn't remember, but I could come back to these books and they'd tell you how to figure it, see, if I'd forgotten it. In fact, I finally wrote it off. Was changing patterns so much. I wrote it off and I put it in my billfold. And whenever I'd get ready to figure, well, I just look at that and figure from it. But you can see books helps you in that respect, because it tells you how to do it. And
now, could you talk to it? You mentioned in 1932, 33, you'd come out, and how many people were hanging around waiting for jobs, and how that worked?
Well, back then,
back in 1932.
Back in 1932, well, people, and it was hard to get a job, and there's a lot of people out of work. But you could go around these plants, especially what we call it shift change, and you couldn't go in them, but you could stand around. Now, some of them you could. There's certain ones you couldn't, but like up here at the bleachery, you could go out there and wait, and they'd send the man out. if he needed 4 workers for the evening shift, he'd come out and he'd point them out to you. He'd say, I'll take you and you and you and you. And he'd pick out the 4, how many that he needed. And they the one that got the job. And they was very fortunate, but there'd maybe be 50 or 100 people there that was still needing work. And it's kind of sad, especially, of course, I was a young man then, but there's some people that I knew that had families that they really needed a job bad, because that was the only way to make a living. Is they didn't have no unemployment insurance or anything of that like we got today.
What influenced the man to say you rather than you?
You know, I've thought about that, and why, I really don't know. Unless maybe when he walked out, the man that was in authority, he may have known these people that he picked out. Now, it's a possibility. I don't know that he knew them. But anyway, it's either that or maybe he liked their looks or something. I really don't know. I really don't.
Now, one more thing. You were telling me about your boss and the family that ran the mill. You had something very nice to say about them. Could you talk about that?
Yes, I'd be glad to talk about.
Just turn more that way. Yeah. Okay.
I'd be glad to talk about that, because I think the Roddies, that was their name. There's a independently owned textile mill, and they were great people. There wasn't a one that I knew of that worked for those. It worked in there any length of time. It wasn't crazy about the Roddy family, because if you needed help in any way, if you was an employee of theirs and been an employee for quite a while, they'd help you in most any way they could. And that they run their plant maybe a little bit lax. Maybe I ought not say that, but it's true. And eventually, it finally did have to close down back in, I believe, in 1958. But I worked there up till that time, from back right before the war, World War II. And so I thoroughly enjoyed those people, because they would, when you had they was making money, they'd throw you a party. They'd put, say, the 4th of July. They may give you a bonus, and they'd say, come on out, we're going to have a picnic. Have the grounds fixed out there, and have all the employees to come out, and they'd have a picnic. And I thoroughly enjoyed that, because there's a lot of the plants around at that time that didn't do that. But they were always real nice to their help. I'll have to say that, because they were good to us.
Okay. Okay, one more thing now, and that's, we don't have to put you through that, except that I want to go to the close-ups on the books now, simulated over his shoulder.
Okay.
Okay?
Okay.
That's exactly right, and then we'll do a couple of illustrations.
I realize, I think it makes it easier when somebody recognizes how hard you're working. Get in sync and it'll be right.
And I'm sure they still use these calculations to figure that by right here, still even today, as old as this book is.
Can you see it plain enough to read it, Dad?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
12,080 divided by 57 equal 22 patterns and 22 dents extra. 60 ends cotton, 2 to a dent equals 30 dents.
3 dents.
Hey?
I'm not saying that.
What? What did we do wrong this time?
You didn't take the soap off that.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, that's usually props does that. So.
I know. It was all right.
Is that pops or props?
You ready?
But there's so many other things that we do get right, George.
I know.
And he jumps on us for the one we miss.
Oh, no, he's not jumping on you. He's only telling you that you failed to do it. I have grandsons that
Okay,
come in and
and
do
you can
things.
turn the page.
And if I say something, well, Grandma, We didn't really mean to do that. They're grown men, 21. So
Yeah.
when they drop something on the floor, on the carpet,
Yeah, could you
they
flip
don't
the
mean
page
to do
back?
it. Never.
Oh, that's good.
Is that the battery? The battery head, Mac? Is that the battery head? No?
Okay.
This is an old-timey loom. It was back about,
Before the
all
ag
back in the,
show?
about 1920, 25.
Oh, goodness.
Real old. It's a jackwood loom.
We got some of those looms over at the museum in
New York?
Columbus.
Okay, just flip the page again.
Here's a picture you might like to see. All right, tell me about your grandfather.
Okay, I don't know exactly where you want me to start, but my grandfather was G.W. Ragan from Gastonia, North Carolina, George Washington Ragan. And he was one of the early textile pioneers in the latter part of the 1800s and the early part of the 1900s. And this is grandfather behind me, a portrait of him that was done in probably the 19th. Setting things up.
Rolling. All right, so just tell about your grandfather.
Fine. My grandfather was G.W. Ragan from Gastonia, North Carolina, the G.W. being for George Washington Ragan. He was born in 1846. He was in the Civil War as a young teenager. I think he went in at 16 or 17 years old. This is my grandfather behind me, G.W. Ragan. He was one of the early textile pioneers in the South in this part of North Carolina in both the late 19th century and early 20th century. Built some of the first mills in that area, and I'll be glad to tell you anything that I know about him, being sort of a textile historian and a family historian.
Could you show us a picture of
Just a moment, please. Jamie, we had one. Yeah, since I'm now rolling.
Okay, sir.
Are we rolling? Okay. My grandfather's name was G.W. Ragan from Gastonia, North Carolina, a textile center, as we know. Was born in 1846. Was a young teenager. He joined the Confederate Army and served in the Army. And the G.W. is for George Washington Ragan. He normally liked to go by G.W. And this is my grandfather, George Washington Ragan, whose portrait is behind me, who was one of the pioneer textile leaders in the South at the end of the 19th century and in the early part of the 20th century, which I'll be talking about. This is my father, Caldwell Ragan, Sr., also from Gastonia, North Carolina, who was one of the textile pioneers starting in 1916, 1917 in the industry, and he was in it for over 50 years at several mills. And I'll be glad to tell you anything that I can. I'm sort of a textile historian of some sorts and a family historian.
Could you show us a picture that's going to show where your grandfather's store was? And
Certainly.
Explain that.
Certainly. Thought maybe a good place to start out is there's a town in Gaston County called McCaddenville, and it's also known today as Christmas Town, USA. Many people have seen it at that time. It's a beautiful little mountainous village between Charlotte and Gastonia, and in a large sense, the textile industry of Gaston County, at least, started in McCaddenville. It wasn't the first mill, but it was one of the really first nice mills built by Colonel R.Y. McCadden, who was a prominent banker and railroad man and later a prominent textile man. But several mills were built at that area, and the town of McCaddenville came into being. And I think what makes it interesting is that people like my grandfather, G.W. Ragan, started there. He ran the McCadden and Ragan General Store, and another gentleman by the name of George A. Gray, who was also one of the textile leaders at the same time. He was the superintendent of the McCadden mills, and at nighttime the story goes that Ragan and Gray would get together after their jobs were over at the store and the mill. They would get together at the general store around the old legendary pot-bellied stove, and they would talk about textiles. They would talk about things that they wanted to do. At the time, they were both did not have the means to do this, but they were interested in getting started.
Just a moment.
Excuse the cuckoo clock. One of the things that I did. The two gentlemen we're talking about, George Ragan and George Gray, and they really, it's a very typical example of how the industry started in this area. My grandfather, G.W. Ragan, ran the store at McCaddenville, the McCadden and Ragan store. George Gray was the superintendent of the McCadden mills. Neither of them had a financial interest in the mill. My grandfather did have a financial interest in the store. But these were two ambitious and energetic men, and the legend goes that after their duties were over during the day, many, many times they would go to the McCadden and Ragan store at nighttime and just talk about their ambitions. They saw that Colonel McCadden, Colonel R.Y. McCadden, was making a tremendous amount of money in the textile business, and they obviously had ideas of their own that they would like to do this someday. So they talked these things over, and in a few years, both of them began building mills in nearby Gastonia. And Ragan was a businessman. He knew the business aspect, he knew buying and selling, and Gray was the technical man, one of the few men at that time that had the actual knowledge of how to run the machinery and the employees of a textile mill. And these two gentlemen got together and founded mills, and it was a typical example with other people in the mill business too. One would be business oriented and the other would be technical oriented. The same was true with the Stows and the Lineberger. The Stows were the business people and the Linebergers were the more technically oriented people. The same with Colonel Armstrong and Wingate and Dunn. Armstrong was the promotional businessman and the others were involved in the more technical knowledge. And the same with Groves and Gray or Groves and Withers, whoever it was. So that's how it started. And to get back to the McCaddenville venture, and it's a beautiful town today. I hope you gentlemen will go by and visit it. I have a few photographs here. This is a photograph, Mr. Stoney, of the original script. Should I hold that up or should
Okay,
Okay.
then you just leave it there and we'll get it over your shoulder
Okay.
later.
Sure.
Let's go back to that, and you just explained what you have there, the script.
Okay, this is the script. It's a copy of script. This particular one is just 10 cents. McCadden Mills will pay to their employees 10 cents in merchandise at the McCadden and Ragan store. And this was a typical way to pay employees back then. It was issued by the mill and took the place of money, and then the employees would spend that money in the store, and thereby providing both the store and the mill with a livelihood and the normal trade that goes on. So I don't know that they were entirely paid in scrip, but certainly a big part of the salary was paid in scrip. McCaddenville is a very beautiful town, and here are some other pictures of there were 3 mills there. This is one of the mills, and these are 2 others, and they were very pretty. They had beautiful bell towers and little turrets that looked like fortresses, and it was probably the first, what I would consider real mill. I mean, where you've got a brick factory building and everything. The others had been in wooden buildings that looked like houses and were very small, and this was a good size, very prosperous operation. From there, the photographs that I have sort of go to Gastonia, because within a few years, in the early, mid to late 1880s. Gastonia, with the coming of the railroad at that area, became the most progressive, the most likely place that industry would start. And people like my grandfather moved there and had a general store at first. And then in 1888, the first cotton mill, the Gastonia Cotton Manufacturing Company, and this is a picture of the Gastonia Cotton Manufacturing Company. It began operations there, and the first yarn ever shipped from Gastonia was on October the 10th, 1888. This venture was, the prime mover was R.C.G. Love, and along with George A. Gray, L.L. Jenkins, J.H. Craig, Captain J.D. Moore, and my grandfather, G.W. Ragan. They were the ones that were the stockholders in that. Mr. Gray was the first superintendent. Just very shortly after that, this was another experience in the life of the town. My grandfather was the prime mover in the second mill in Gastonia, the Trenton Cotton Mills. This was in 1893, and he was very pleased to have with him Mr. George Gray as the superintendent of the mill. That mill, the Trenton, was in operation for over 80 years. My father, Caldwell Ragan, was also one of the managers of the mill during his time in the industry. He had gone into it after they had sold another mill, and then he went back into the business at the Trenton. The building is still there, and it's a very good architectural description of how textile mills look, because even though it's not running as a factory now, it hasn't been, the windows haven't been bricked over and everything. It looks like one of the pretty old textile factories, and it is on Main Street in Gastonia.
Now, one thing.
Certainly.
These handsome old mills were built for something other than just to house the factory. Why is it that the factories then were so well designed compared with the way they look now?
Well, I don't know that well designed is the word, but they made to us of a different generation look more beautiful, because you had towers. The towers held things like bells and offices that would probably not be needed today. The offices probably would not be big enough. The bells would not be needed. You had smokestacks. Of course, the early mills, at least off of the ones that were inland off the streams, were steam mills. And so you had to have these big, beautiful smokestacks and water towers. And later, mills were designed more simply, which may have been a better design as far as the functional aspect of the mills, but they didn't look quite as, or what I think is quite as beautiful, because they didn't have these big, beautiful towers.
I may be fishing for something that's false, and tell me, but were these designed to be a kind of statement of the owner?
I think that was probably true,
explain
but
that as though I didn't ask the question.
Yes, you're partially explaining it, but I don't know that was all the way true. I can't really speak to that, because in the early days, as we had discussed at one of our other conversations, capital money was extremely hard to come by. Now later, that may have changed somewhat, but I guess it was making a statement. It was the New South. A lot of these mill ventures, it was really a community effort. Like the Trenton Cotton Mill, and my G.W. Ragan and George A. Gray were the founders, but it had farmers, it had distillers involved, it had doctors, it had lawyers involved. The whole town of Gastonia was trying to raise itself not only from the Civil War, but it was a new town too, and the area was distraught from Reconstruction. So yes, they were very proud that they were having a place there for employment and the circulation of money. circulation of money was extremely important in the early days. I don't think we can even understand it now because there was very little, if any, cash money in the community. It was really a distraught area after the Civil War. People weren't starving. There were good, fine folks here, but it was mainly a farming area. And the thought of going to a job that paid cash money was unusual and different and very appealing for anybody to be able to get money and then go to the store and buy store-bought goods. So in that way, yes, it was a statement of the community that we're going to rise above our problems, and this is going to be something that is prosperous and is going to be something that's going to be improved on in the future. So they did know they were laying the foundation for a town, a city, an industry, and for wealth in the South. And these things did happen. It didn't happen overnight.
Now, your talk about the building of the cotton mill villages, just mention the fact that were built. Why were they built? Okay,
I do have a good feeling on this, and a lot of it is from talking with older people and from
I do have a good feeling about what?
About the mill villages.
Let's
and
start over. I do have it.
I have a very good feeling about why mill villages were started in conjunction with the mills during the early days, both from talking with older people through my lifetime and also from the minute books of some of the Ragan controlled mills that specifically addressed this information. And I was brought up during an era when everything that I read and everything that was asked of me indicated that the mill villages were built to, how should we say it, control the employees, to keep them there and everything. And maybe it developed into that at a later date, but in the late 1800s and early 1900s, I feel very strongly from what I have studied and learned, the mill villages were a necessity, were a complete necessity. The raising of capital, I can't stress that strongly enough, was a very difficult thing, and to have extra money to build a mill village that was not an absolute necessity did not make economic sense. If I may take just a little time to go over one story that I think may be interesting to us, is when my grandfather, G.W. Ragan, had decided to build the Trenton cotton mills at Gastonia. This was in 1892 when they decided to build it. It was completed in 1893. The first person he contacted was George Gray, who had the technical knowledge. Grandfather Ragan was in charge of raising the money for the mill. The amount sounds small. I think $60,000 or $65,000 was enough to build a 3,000 or 4,000 spindle yarn mill, cotton mill at that time. Ragan and Gray had some money to put in it. They contacted doctors and lawyers, anyone that they knew that had money. They would work very hard to find somebody with $2,000 or $3,000 or $4,000 that could be put into the mill. And the interesting case that I'm trying to get around to is that one gentleman by the name of H.D. Stowe, S-T-O-W-E, lived across the Catawba River in Mecklenburg County. And my grandfather knew that Mr. Stowe was a prosperous farmer and had some money to invest. So on horseback, my grandfather and Mr. Gray went over to see Mr. Stowe, and this was back during the days that things didn't move as fast. You had to spend most of the day to get across the river and to talk with people, and you didn't get right down to business. You talked about other things. But anyway, they went over and talked to Mr. Stowe and sort of told him why they had come. They were telling Mr. Stowe that they were organizing a cotton mill in Gastonia, and that they thought that the prospects were good for the mill to make money and to pay dividends, and they would like for him to put in what he felt like he could do, $3,000 or $4,000 in stock in the Trenton cotton mills. And he said Mr. Stowe was sort of interested, and he said, well, you gentlemen said, won't you please stay for dinner? They called a midday meal back then, which was a very large meal, dinner. So my grandfather and Mr. Gray stayed for dinner. Mrs. Stowe had them in, and they started talking, and they were telling Ms. Stowe about the prospects of this cotton mill. And Mr. Stowe said, well, Mrs. Stowe